Video games are an amazing subject to study if you are willing to look. The technology is usually ahead of anything anyone else is doing. We can predict what will happen in modern culture by looking at what happened to games 5 to 10 years ago. We can also watch as it becomes accepted within gaming as it goes from more advanced to common. What happens on PC moves over to console and then handheld. I thought it would be interesting to show you how fast this works, so you can see the pattern yourself. I've chosen memory size because that is the easiest to see and explore. And I chose first-person shooters because they tend to be kind of heavy on the graphics. Before we begin, I think it's important I show you the power of 2. Computers use this system a lot, and you can see it throughout the history of gaming. Basically, every few years, the power of memory of something will double in size. So memory will go from 1 to 2 to 4, and so on until in 10 years it will reach over 1,000. So at one point a megabit is huge, and then in 10 years a gigabyte is huge, and then a terabyte. It's all following at different paces, but you can see these numbers slowly working as you get older. It gets even more insane when you really think about it. Think about a very large number. Something you have difficulties even imagining. Because of the way memory is working, the memory of your computer will reach that point within your lifetime. I also want to point out that I am not the first person to notice some of these patterns. The man who wrote the book on how innovation works, Clayton Christensen, studied memory when he came out with his solutions. He was shocked to see a pattern in how the newer product was being sold to a different audience than the original memory company. Like my last study, he has shown the patterns I didn't know existed. I went in and found new details, but it was based on his works, so if you want to learn more about the history of memory, look him up. I'll leave a link to some of his work in the video description. When Doom came out, we had computers that could barely run it. The average computer had almost 16 megabytes of RAM, while we swapped games back and forth on 1.44 megabyte floppy disks. A hard drive would have around 20 megabytes of memory as well. Doom came in at 24 megabytes large. It would compress itself down to 12 megabytes after installation, but that is still several floppy disks. To install, you had to place the first floppy in, then the next one, marked 2, and keep going until the entire thing was installed. The game came with a sheet of paper recommending at least 4 megabytes of RAM to get things to work properly. They also recommended a card dedicated to creating sound. Doom was released for the Super Nintendo, but many animations were missing, the size of the game screen was smaller, and certain levels were not ported over. It was not a pretty game, but it did work. Just 3 years later, the same company that made Doom released Quake. It required 80 megabytes of hard drive space for it to be installed. Then a fast CD-ROM drive would also be needed to get things moving quickly. There was a floppy disk version, but it would take a while to get it all installed. At the very least, Quake needed 8 megabytes of RAM, but the recommended amount was 24 megabytes. That is the entirety of Doom for the hard drive needed for just the RAM. These requirements meant ports to consoles were difficult, and often had the same problems as the ports of Doom to the Super NES. Levels were missing, graphical abilities were scaled down, and everything looked a little bit chunkier. CD-ROMs became popular at this time, and were used for several games. The computer would stream data like videos and other easy information over the computer to work with. Games like Myst became popular, where you stared at a non-moving screen with a few animations and a video every now and then. This was a trick to get around the fact that the CD had more memory than the hard drive, but could not be accessed very easily. Myst, for example, was one of the best-selling games of all time. It basically sold the CD-ROM drive for players. The puzzles were difficult to figure out and everything was kind of point and click, but videos played and everything looked like an actual picture, so people loved it. Because it was basically streaming from the CD-ROM drive, the RAM requirements were only 4 megabytes, and the hard drive needed 8 megabytes to run. Several ports of the game were released to consoles all over the place, and they worked fairly well, if a bit awkward at some points. There was a requirement for a video card, but not for 3D rendering at all. This meant ports to consoles like the Sega CD-ROM wouldn't look as good. The Nintendo 64 got a great first-person shooter called Goldeneye 007 in 1997. That doesn't seem too important, but the game begins to compete in popularity with the bigger games that came out at the same time. It has memory restraints and everything else, but it is released when the N64 is fairly young and advanced. People want to play a good first-person shooter. Unreal released in 1998, or 2 years after Quake. It required a video card with 3D rendering abilities, along with 223 megabytes of space to install. It also required that the player have the latest form of Windows installed, because DOS was no longer an operating system for the latest games. The graphics card showed up for Quake, but were used later as a patch. Unreal required the latest video card and demanded the full use of it to play the game. It also introduced the new requirements of load times. The next level had to be loaded from memory into RAM and also have parts prepared for rendering, so you could sit for a minute or two while waiting for the next part to load. There wasn't a release of the game to any consoles. They did attempt to port it to Nintendo 64 and then Dreamcast, but neither lasted long enough for the port to be released. Literally, it was just too powerful for consoles at the time of its release. The same year as Unreal, the amazing Half-Life came out. It was technically a modified version of the Quake engine, but added technical details for greater things. The graphics requirements were not as great as Unreal, but it was still recommended to have a 32 megabyte GPU. The hard drive space needed was 400 megabytes, and then a RAM recommendation of 128 megabytes. The game had several loading times, and they could take minutes in waiting to get from this level to the next. The designers strung the levels together as if it was one story, so it felt like a commercial break at random times. Let's stop for a moment and realize that Doom is only 5 years old at the time of Half-Life and Unreal, and yet a computer that can run either of these new games could easily run Doom. I don't mean Doom as it was designed, but every level could be loaded and played without a stop or need to pause as they went from area to area to get bloody revenge. In fact, you could have several Dooms being played at the same time without much of a notice on your computer. This creates a point in time where the latest games and computers no longer consider Doom as anything special. Hard drives have gone from megabytes to gigabytes. RAM has also risen, but not as fast as the hard drive. I am nicknaming this an innovation point because of how quickly the specs now dwarf the original game. There is a similar point for Nintendo where all of the original NES games could fit into a single N64 cartridge. This point marks the time when game designers go for complex and memory-sucking programs in 3D over the much easier pixel creations beforehand. But let's continue. A few years after Half-Life and Unreal, and following on the tail of GoldenEye 007, the Xbox gets its own first-person shooter that rules the roost. Halo Combat Evolved. It needed 1.2 gigabytes and a RAM size of 512 megabytes. Even greater, they had a requirement of 32 megabytes of RAM for the video card itself. It followed the same ideas as Half-Life by having a continuous, moving story with loading between levels. The designers often used videos playing or having to battle monsters to take care of the load times without being seen. There were parts, though, that made it obvious what was happening. The sequel to Half-Life took a lot longer to make than expected. The new game had things like scripted movements, full conversations, physics guns, and the ability to kill a zombie with a toilet. This meant extra time doing things, and then much beefier specs than the original. Like Halo, it required 512 megabits of RAM, but much more hard drive space. The game was a staggering 6.5 gigabytes large, and had loading times that could take minutes to load. The joke went you could forget what you were doing while waiting for things to load. Half-Life 2 was ported to the original Xbox and didn't have too many changes to work on the console. This marks the point when the same version of console and PC games are released at the same time. The orange box released for Xbox 360, PS3, and PC at roughly the same time. This reaches the next pivot point. Half-Life, the original, could be completely loaded into the RAM of a computer running Half-Life 2. This change in gaming specs created a difficulty to find a follow-up first-person shooter. The Xbox 360 had several FPS games, but they didn't get much bigger than the games for the Xbox. Modern Warfare needed 8 gigabytes for the hard drive, but 128 megabytes for the graphics card. Even larger games could fit into the space requirement. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas was huge, but only 7 gigabytes. Then we have Skyrim, which was 6 gigabytes, but required 2 to 4 gigabytes of RAM. As far as I could tell, the loading speed of the hard drives and disk drives slowed things down by a lot. It also doesn't help that most game makers use the consoles as a base, so many games ended up throttled down to meet the standards. A combination of both meant a lot of games didn't grow in size. This doesn't mean none of the games grew in time. The Grand Theft Auto series jumped in size for the high-definition consoles. GTA 4 needed 16 gigabytes of hard drive space, or nearly triple the space of San Andreas. The RAM levels stayed dormant though, at 512 megabytes. This means getting phone calls from the ugly cousin took up space, but not a lot of quickly needed memory. I find this to be accurate for the character. Crysis was specifically designed to not be playable on the consoles. People would joke that only a supercomputer could play it. Oh, you came from outer space and you can like totally load up the world's knowledge, man. But can you run Crysis? At 12 gigabytes in hard drive space, it didn't seem that big. The 2 gigabytes in RAM, though, was huge at the time. Then the graphics card needed to have at least 640 megabytes to properly run things. That means the graphics card could load all of the original Half-Life into itself. It was designed to be heavy and difficult unless you had the latest, most powerful specs. This was in direct defiance to how all the other companies aimed their games to look good on a PS3 or Xbox 360. Grand Theft Auto V, of course, had an even larger number at 72 gigabytes. That is nearly 5 times the amount of the previous game. It is also 10 times the amount of San Andreas, which is the same area as 5. The RAM gets even better, because it is 4 gigabytes, with a recommendation of 8 gigabytes, or San Andreas completely loaded on the RAM itself. Things get interesting for GTA 5, because it was given higher resolutions, a new paint job, and more effects for a re-release on the PS4 and PC. This new version comes in at 120 gigabytes, or nearly twice the original game. There's also a first-person mode, so you can play it like a giant game of Doom. But it gets better, because fans of the game made it even shinier. They upgraded all the textures and resolution, along with adding things like ray casting. These add-ons go 70 gigabytes here, 30 gigabytes there, and a hard drive space needed becomes nearly 240 gigabytes large. The big graphics hog and killer app, Doom, Return to console, PC, and handheld in Doom, the 2016 edition, and then Doom Eternal. They have basically the same spec requirements, but need beefier graphics cards for the larger resolutions. At 50 gigabytes, they can rip and tear the smaller sized hard drives for the PS4 apart. You would need to only have one installed at a time to keep things going. The RAM size is 8 gigabytes or more than Half-Life 2 and the other games for Orange Box combined. At this point, RAM is at 16 and even 32 gigabytes, so Doom seems small at some points. But to run it at the highest specs, you need 16 gigs of RAM, and then 16 gigs of RAM on the video card as well. So your video card could run Crysis on its own without much of a hitch. The RAM could load the original GTA San Andreas several times. This sounds pretty amazing, but you should be noticing something. All those specs can also be done on phone. The Nintendo Switch has phone parts inside of it and could play Doom. It wasn't an amazing picture, but it could play it. Nintendo was specifically slowing down the console power to save battery life. The reality is most modern games have GPUs that are the equivalent to a medium-level graphics card. That means Doom Eternal, which came out last year at the time of this video, could be played on a modern phone. This means phones are catching up and have reached many of the same innovation points as the consoles and PCs. That's a lot to take in. In fact, it's the theme of my next video in this series. Sorry for all the data. I'm sure I messed up somewhere, and you are already raging in the comments that GTA 5 was only 55 gigabytes, and how dare I say 120, or that it's gigabits instead of gigabytes. I know, trust me, it gets detailed and boring at the same time. I've left links for most of my stats in the description, so you can find what I've been working on. What I really want to do is thank you for viewing this video, and I would highly recommend some of the videos I've already made. Check out fundamentals of understanding of, how shall we call it, money laundering schemes in video game culture. I'm sure you can find something interesting there. Check out my various other platforms as well, and also maybe check out the people whose videos I used to make this video. I really can't do it without them, and they deserve a lot of praise. Hey, if you want to be really nice, I have a Patreon. You're right, I'm terrible at it, but that's because I don't know what I'm doing, and nobody's paid me for it, so I don't know what I'm doing even less. Well, thank you very much.